Hi, we're here with Marcia Freeman, Managing Editor of 21st Century Science and Technology magazine and previous Washington editor of the Fusion Energy Foundation. She is here to give us some insights on the fight for fusion, where it is and where it's going. So Marcia, tell us a little bit about your fight for fusion, sort of the history of the Fusion Energy Foundation and what the fight is all about.
Sure. The Fusion Energy Foundation was put together in the mid-1970s at the initiation of Lyndon LaRouche to help really push forward progress in thermonuclear fusion power. From the late 1960s up through the beginning of the 70s, very impressive improvement and research accomplishments were being made, progress in the magnetic fusion energy program. And those experiments were taking place here in the United States, in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and starting in Japan and other countries. It was very clear to Mr. LaRouche and to the people working in the fusion field that this was really what we were going to need for the future, that we had nuclear fission, and many countries in the world were building nuclear plants, but that fusion would really usher in a whole new era of plasma technologies, of tremendously increased capabilities for electricity, materials, development, even propulsion to go into space. So this was really the frontier, and the Fusion Energy Foundation gathered around it some of really the leading and most creative researchers in fusion work. We published a magazine called Fusion, and it was very interesting because when we started the magazine, people didn't know how to spell fusion. They thought it was fission with a U. So we had a very big educational job, and the purpose of the magazine and all of the activities that the foundation engaged in were really a public education program. This also meant policymakers in Washington, because we wanted to have an educated public, but you wanted their voices to be heard in the halls of Congress as well. If the budget had to be considered, this was going to have to be done by Congress. A long-term research and development perspective for developing fusion, this would have to be a law in Washington. So very early on, we sort of had the double-edged responsibility of educating the American public through the magazine, conferences, standing in airports and at unemployment centers and anywhere else that people gathered, and teaching them what fusion was and what the future could look like, at the same time that we had a very strong educational campaign in Washington and also in state legislatures. But we felt that congressmen who certainly may not have a technical background would really have to get up to snuff, learn what fusion was, and then we could have an impact on policy. So we also testified in Congress at many different hearings on fusion, on energy programs, and really made fusion almost a household word. And I think that was really a very wonderful accomplishment of the Fusion Energy Foundation.
Great. Now, what is the fight? Basically, why don't we have fusion today?
I think that's a very important question. The experiments that started in the 1960s started off rather small, but as the scientists were getting encouraging results, they were able to scale up their experiments, make, of course, improvements, and so by really the mid-1970s, we were showing very impressive results in fusion research, both here and in the Soviet Union in particular. There was a lot of optimism. Every year, every few years, you could see that we were coming closer to the requirements for fusion. Fusion is a difficult technology because you're dealing not with the kinds of elements that we're accustomed to every day. you're dealing with what we call the fourth state of matter, which is a plasma. And a plasma is just an ionized gas, but it means that it's energetic enough, let's say hot enough, so that your typical element, hydrogen or anything else, the electrons have been stripped away. So you have the nuclei positively charged and the electrons, and this is a gas. It's kind of like a big soup, but you can control it with magnets and electrical currents. But it's a different state of matter, and it can be very challenging. We certainly have had fusion energy for a long time in the hydrogen bomb, but controlling the fusion process in a plasma presented a lot of challenges. The results through the mid-1970s were very encouraging, and next step, larger experiments were being planned in various parts of the world. This led to a very active lobbying in the Congress by the Fusion Energy Foundation, and also congressmen with either some technical background themselves or those who were just very forward-looking and could be a little visionary and knew that fusion was necessary. So there was a very important acceleration of the fusion program throughout the 1970s. In those days, it was really expected that 10 years later, by 1990, we could have kind of an engineering test reactor. Not something ready for a utility to buy, but something that would demonstrate that fusion energy could be controlled and that the fusion process could produce useful energy. And then by the year 2000, the projection was we could have a commercial demonstration plant, the first fusion power plant that would put electricity on the power grid and bring it to your home. This was codified into law. This was actually a law that was signed at the end of 1980 by President Carter. And this Magnetic Fusion Energy Engineering Act, which was really put forward by Representative Mike McCormick from the state of Washington, had those two milestones: an engineering test facility by 1990 and a commercial demonstration reactor by the year 2000. So the stories that people tell today, you know, that fusion is always 50 years away and it's so hard we probably will never do it, nobody believed that in the 1970s. They were all ready and prepared to meet the milestones in this timeline. The problem was that 1980 election, President Reagan was the candidate who won, and unfortunately, the economic policy of the Reagan administration through the 1980s saw tremendous cutbacks, not only in fusion, but in many advanced research and development programs. This was just the very false notion that the free market and commercial interests would take care of the U.S. economy. So since the early 1980s, the fusion program in the United States has been tremendously slowed down, and one could even say crippled, where now the funding level is perhaps a third in real dollars of what it was in the early 1980s. And when you cut back the funding of a program, you shut down promising experiments, you don't train the next generations of scientists and engineers, and you lose the edge internationally, which the United States has done. You can always say that fusion is 50 years away if you're never going to give the people working on it enough money to finish it.
Okay, can you give us a picture of what the current status is right now of fusion research?
Well, over these last 20 years, a number of interesting and I think potentially very important approaches to developing fusion power were closed down. The program that we have today, especially in the United States, under this very, very restricted funding profile, is really limited to a very small handful of experiments along what is called kind of the mainline approach. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union developed the concept for fusion, which the acronym from the Russian is tokamak. And this is a donut-shaped device, so it's circular, closed, and the plasma is inside the donut. And this was a very promising approach. They were getting very good results. So the United States and other countries adopted this geometry for fusion. Many other programs were looking at different geometries. This is a magnetic confinement approach. You can change the configuration of the magnets. You can change the shape of the plasma. You can have a linear geometry. Instead of a closed donut circle, you could have what was called a mirror machine that has both ends open. So there were many, many approaches being pursued. As the money shrank and the breadth of the fusion program contracted, we were really left with what we have today, which is basically three large tokamak experiments, a few smaller experiments, particularly at universities, and really no other more creative approaches being pursued.
And this is the case internationally.
Internationally, you still have a few machines that are operating with alternative geometries, not the breadth of what we had in the 1970s, but just at least a little more creative input than we have here.
So there's been a lot of talk about the fusion budget in the United States and concerns that the U.S. fusion program is facing severe cuts. What's the current status of this, and what would happen if these cuts go through?
I think that's very, very important. Even though historically the fusion program has shrunk to probably a third of the size that it was when we had an optimistic worldview and a real plan to have fusion energy, you have some very excellent experiments that have been ongoing, wonderful people, some of whom who have been doing fusion research for many years, but also many young people who have come into the field, more of whom are needed. And yet, the fusion program has been under attack in this administration, but really as a function of the worldwide economic collapse, which has seen not just the fusion budget, the NASA budget for the U.S. space program, the fusion budgets in Europe, many of the science and R&D programs on the chopping block, along with everything else, from healthcare to pensions, that this whole economic policy of cutting the budget, to think that we're going to, there's no hope, of course, of balancing the budget, but that we'll be able to steal that money to bail out banks is really having a dramatic effect on the U.S. fusion program. The United States is one of the partners in ITER, the international tokamak being built in France, and each of the partners contributes 10% of the total cost, except Europe, because they're building it, they have 45%. It has been very well known for a number of years that the U.S. financial commitment to ITER this year would be about $150 million, which is unbelievably small amount of money. However, what the Obama administration said was, all right, that's an international commitment that we have, so we will do that. We will put the $150 million for fiscal 2014, which starts October 1st, into ITER and meet our commitment. But we are not going to increase the fusion budget overall. Last year, we put $50 million into ITER. So this added $100 million is not going to be because we're adding money to the total. We're going to take it out of the U.S. fusion program. They are proposing to shut down the tokamak experiment, which is called the Alcator at MIT in Boston. Just shut it down and lay off over 100 scientists and engineers. They are threatening to cut the budget for the Princeton fusion program, where they have experiments ongoing. And the heads of the Princeton fusion program say that they are going to have to also lose scientific and technical staff. So there could not be a more stupid approach to this than the one that's been put forward, for the simple reason that when ITER becomes operational, we are entitled to have scientists and engineers there participating, running experiments on ITER. We're a partner in the project, and we are getting rid of our most experienced fusion researchers. And of course, what goes along with that is not bringing in a next generation, the people who really will be doing the experiments 10, 15 years from now. So this is a disaster. It has been very vocally objected to by the fusion community in hearings, in letters to the editor of scientific publications, letters to Congress. And, we will see how this turns out. But right now, it's a disaster.
Okay, 21st Century Science and Technology just put out a special report on the new economy driven by a fusion future, not necessarily just fusion power, but a fusion economy, an economy that's based on that type of control over matter. Can you give us a sense of, one, what are the challenges that must be overcome to get to a fusion economy, and then also maybe your idea of what a fusion economy looks like?
I think that we have a lot of challenges still to move from the experiments that we have now to the next much larger planned tokamak experiment. This is the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, which is being built in France. But this is a cooperative program which involves not only the European countries and the United States and Russia and Japan, which are sort of the traditional countries doing fusion research, but also China, South Korea, and India. So this is a very broad coalition, if you will, which really comprises the majority of the world's population. And this is a tokamak reactor, which is going to become operational in terms of starting to do experiments in about 7 or 8 years. And so this is really the next big step that we have in fusion. The challenges that remain are certainly in materials, where you're handling a plasma, which is hundreds of millions potentially of degrees. There's no known material that could withstand that kind of temperature. And you're not going to have a material that can tolerate that temperature, but you're going to have high temperatures in the fusion products, what you produce after you fusion the nuclei together. So the materials challenge is one that really is urgent, that work really must start on that. There are other engineering questions and technologies that will have to be developed, and also scientific questions that still need to be answered in terms of how the plasma behaves, what the problems are. Plasmas can be not very well behaved from the standpoint of trying to keep them under control with magnetic fields. And there are other approaches that are more elegant and sort of play along with the plasma, if you will, and take advantage of the fact that this electrically charged gas organizes itself into structures. But all of these challenges still remain, and especially after ITER, to have not an experiment, but a reactor that not only produces fusion energy, but does it consistently. We have power plants today that run 24/7, and you certainly are not going to put a fusion power plant on the grid if it's going to be able to run 3 hours a day and then needs parts changed or fixed. So we have all the engineering work, the materials work, some of the scientific questions that we still have to deal with. In terms of the fusion economy, I mean, what we have with nuclear fission is a very efficient way of producing heat. Certainly orders of magnitude increased energy density from burning coal, much less wood or anything else. But with fusion, the energy is orders of magnitude in density higher than that. You're talking about a very concentrated form of energy. And with a range of different fusion fuels, you also are talking about a range of electromagnetic energy. In other words, in fission, the energy is really the neutrons that are produced from the process of breaking apart fissile uranium or other elements. But in fusion, the product that comes out doesn't have to be neutrons. It can be gamma rays. It can be, the whole range of electromagnetic radiation. And those electromagnetic products can be used for various things, for treating materials, etc. You can use the plasma itself and the products that come out as charged particles as plasma for materials processing. You can use the plasma products, which are at very high temperatures, for fusion propulsion to take you, as was once described, to the ends of the solar system without it taking 6 or 7 years. So fusion plasmas, which can be controlled with magnetic fields and which give you this very wide range of different products, will have very, very broad applications in the economy.
What do you think a crash program could look like if we got really serious about this and got rid of the monetary constraints and said, as a national priority, as a real mission for the country, we see this as an absolute necessity, and even potentially collaborating closely with other nations. So if it was just a real mission orientation, what do you think could be done in terms of developing fusion power in this fusion economy if we had that type of national mission? What might that look like, or how might that accelerate the whole program?
I think if you look at what some other countries are doing, which, unlike the Obama administration, are not trying to completely wreck the fusion program. If you looked, for example, at South Korea and at China, you would see countries that consider the development of fusion energy a necessity, not something interesting, not something useful, but something absolutely necessary. They, as national government priority projects, are already planning for the next stages. Since the 1970s, scientists and engineers in the United States and Europe and Japan have done a lot of work designing what the next step fusion reactors should look like. None of these, however, have gotten past the stage of designing them on paper. But in Korea and in China, there are actually groups now of scientists and engineers who are doing serious design work to implement the next step after ITER, which they're calling demo, for a demonstration reactor. The difference in their approach to not even what we're doing, even what Europe is doing, which has been a little more serious than we, is they're saying, you don't wait for ITER to go online and produce results. That would put off for 10 or 15 years starting on the next step. What you do is work on them in parallel. You do the design work now on demo. A number of years ago, after you pin down the design and you see how ITER is coming together, you can start digging the hole and start the work of building this demo reactor. This is the approach that the fusion program in the United States took in the 1970s when we were optimistic and funding the program and making very rapid progress. The Princeton Large Torus, which gave us wonderful results in the late 1970s, it reached 60 million degrees in the plasma, which under certain conditions would be an ignition temperature. This was a very important breakthrough. The scientists at Princeton had not been waiting for all the results from the Princeton Large Torus to start the next machine, which was the TFTR, the Tokamak Fusion Test Reactor. While the first smaller tokamak was still being built and then undergoing testing, they already had designed the next step tokamak and had really started the construction. So you don't do these things in parallel, one after the other. You do them in parallel. And that's what the Chinese and the South Koreans are saying. We do the design work and get demo moving now. We don't wait till the last experiment 15 years ago, that we have the results from ITER. So even though the United States and Europe and other people have done design studies, these are two countries that are going to go ahead and do that. Korea and China have the only two superconducting magnet tokamaks in the world. ITER is going to have superconducting magnets. They're going to be necessary when we go to a commercial demo. And the only two reactors in the world with this technology are in South Korea and China. So this is going to be, as you mentioned, it has to be a worldwide effort.
And going back to the 1970s, the U.S. population and the European population have been really inundated with this idea of limits to growth, that we have limited resources, we have limited power, that to quote-unquote sustain the economy and sustain mankind's existence on the planet means using less, lowering our consumption, lowering our energy intake. Fusion seems to blow that concept out of the water in terms of completely changing mankind's capabilities to support a growing population with more power, more access to resources. Can you elaborate how fusion will really allow a continuous growth for the U.S. economy in those terms?
I think one of the things that interested and excited developing countries about fusion, going back to even the very early days, looking around the world and seeing what energy resources have looked like. The control over petroleum, right, by all of the British oil companies in the Middle East. The cartels that today control almost all of the natural uranium mining, fabrication, right, that we need for our fission plants. One of the things that I think was really important to nations around the world is that the fuel for fusion, especially for the first generation reactors, come from seawater. No one is ever going to have a monopoly on that energy resource. And this is, I think, is an important consideration. And certainly they felt they would really be able to undo the stranglehold that developing countries have lived with because of the cartel stranglehold on natural resources. So I think that that is not an unimportant factor. The other thing is that everybody knows that all of the resources on Earth are finite. The Earth is finite. We definitely, absolutely, will use fusion propulsion to go out and use the resources of other worlds. But even so, and even until then, in a certain sense, What fusion does through the materials processing capabilities is reduce the dependence of people on concentrated bodies of natural ores and minerals. Again, where you have certain countries that have a very blessed, abundance of whatever, uranium, alumina to make aluminum, iron, manganese, right, all the rare earth metals, which became a whole political football with China. This gives you the freedom to develop your economy using whatever you have, just the earth. And there always was a metaphor used to say if you took a square kilometer or whatever of dirt from your backyard, obviously you probably don't have a concentrated, iron ore reserve in your backyard, but if you break that dirt down into its constituent elements, you have very usable resources. So it frees, again, mankind from thinking about our base of resources as these concentrations of ore, most of which have been organic, produced by life anyway. But that, I think, is a very key point. And then I think it's not a small, consideration that fusion propulsion does open up what is a very resource-rich solar system for human exploitation. Initially on the moon, the asteroids. We can go out to Jupiter. There's so much hydrogen, and, we could take our fuel for fusion en route just from the plasma in interplanetary space. So then you're looking millennia into the future in terms of a resource space. But I think that those are two very key considerations.
Could you maybe elaborate for people who are not familiar with what makes fusion propulsion different than the kind of propulsion systems we have now? How will that change our access to the solar system and space?
Well, the propulsion systems that we have now are almost entirely chemically based, where you're burning some kind of rocket fuel, which is a petroleum derivative, or some kinds of other chemicals that don't need oxygen to burn. They just ignite on contact. The other technology that's been developed is using electric propulsion, and this is not for people. This is to send spacecraft that are unmanned far distances, because they're very efficient, because you can make the electrical energy for the propulsion system just by putting solar panels on it, or using small amounts of isotopes of radioactive material, very far distances very efficiently. The problem with electric propulsion is that it's very, very slow and doesn't necessarily save you very much time unless you're going very far, but it's very efficient. Chemical propulsion is not very efficient, but it gives you the kind of thrust and oomph where you can launch heavy payloads like people, and of course the space shuttle used chemical propulsion. But the limitations of both of those are both speed and efficiency, and also how much payload you can carry. If 90% of what you're launching off the face of the Earth is fuel, that's not a very efficient system. What you can do with fusion propulsion is, and there are a lot of different ways of measuring this, but because you're getting fusion energy at such a much orders of magnitude higher temperature, that can translate into a much faster speed. And, there are equations to do that, but you're talking about being able to not just, the way we went to the moon was to get our men into Earth orbit first using chemical propulsion, let them orbit the Earth a few times to make sure everything was okay, and then igniting another rocket with them to send them on a trajectory to the moon. They carried all their fuel with them, and they carried all the fuel they needed, obviously, to get back. What you really did was kick them out of Earth orbit, and then they glided, right? They just coasted. Nothing, no engines were burning. It must have been very quiet. And it took them 2.5 days to get there, and the moon is not very far. What you could do with fusion is not just get into Earth orbit and then give yourself a kick and then glide, but actually keep your propulsion system running continuously. In space, there is no friction. There's nothing to slow you down. So if you're going 50 miles an hour and you add 10 miles an hour to your speed, you're now going 60, and you're going to keep going 60, right? There's no friction of the road to slow you down, right? So if you're accelerating, just to use that silly example, 10 miles an hour every few minutes, it adds up, right? So over time, you're going faster and faster and faster. Doing that under a constant acceleration, you can really get to Mars in a few days. That opens up whole ranges, both unmanned and definitely manned, to the reaches of the solar system. It makes it practical for the first time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marcia. I think our audience thanks you too.
You're welcome.